She was already carrying the child when she attended her husband's funeral. In the weeks that followed, neighbors recalled seeing her walk in front of her home at dusk, one hand on her swelling belly as if guarding it from the world. She kept to herself, speaking little, refusing offers of help, and shuttering the windows even during daytime. When the boy arrived, some say that she treated him as if he were more than a son, as if he had taken someone's place. Years passed, but the paper trail was almost empty. One birth entry in the county ledger. No marriage, no burial records, nothing to explain what happened after. Was he a son, or was he meant to be the return of someone else entirely? And why did the rest of his life vanish from the records? Before we turn the page on this record, I want to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Share your location and the current hour in the comments below. And while you are here with us, subscribe to X Archives, so that stories like this, sealed, misplaced, and almost erased, can be told again. Because what you are about to hear is not speculation, but the last surviving trace of a life that should have been impossible to forget. In the county ledger, the ink had thinned to a faded brown. On one line, a winter birth in 1880 was recorded, the father's name left absent, the mother's written with careful precision. Just beneath, on the same leaf and in the same hand, a second entry appeared, dated 21 years later, marking the marriage of that same woman to the very boy she had brought into the world. The order of the pages was correct, yet the proximity of the entries felt wrong. Records were not meant to bind two such events so tightly together. The clerk, now long dead, had left no explanation for why the space between was so narrow or why other births in that year filled whole pages. Yet, this boy's life seemed compressed, as though his story could be told without the usual intervening detail. Those details did exist, scattered in other ledgers, in quiet notes penned by midwives and county visitors. They told of a house set at the farthest reach of a wagon track where a widow carried out her pregnancy in solitude. She refused aid, even from family, insisting on her ability to manage alone. In summer, the child was seen in the garden, never far from her side, silent when others passed. Neighbors recalled the impression that he was not being raised to leave her, but to remain, part of the house as much as its walls. By adolescence, the resemblance between mother and son was remarked on in tones neither admiring nor openly critical. The same high cheekbones, the same heavy-lidded gaze. It was said she dressed him in garments cut down from her late husband's clothing, sometimes altering the cuffs and collar herself at the table by lamplight. A traveling photographer who passed through one autumn left a plate that survives still. In it, she is seated, her hand resting lightly on the young man's shoulder, their expressions level and matched. County visitors noted his absence from school records, attributing it to illness, though no such illness was ever specified. The boy was rarely seen in town except in her company. They bought provisions suited for one household, not two separate lives. When he turned 21, those who encountered him described the unsettling impression of seeing the dead husband restored in youth. The widow herself was heard to remark that she was no longer alone, as if a long wait had reached its end. The ceremony was brief, conducted in the county office. Two distant relatives stood witness, their signatures neat but faint, as if pressed with reluctance. She wore her wedding gown from decades earlier, its silk slightly dulled blue, tea intact. The clerk entered the marriage into the ledger without annotation. Within months, rumors spread of attempts to have a child, and of births that ended quietly, unmarked except in whispered recollections of infants too much alike to survive. In later years, the marriage entry vanished from the ledger. The page had been removed cleanly, leaving no ragged edge. No official inquiry followed, and in time, the absence was simply accepted. The son's name disappeared from all subsequent county records. Some said he left without a word, others claimed he never had the chance. The widow remained alone until her death, wearing her ring each day, the silk gown folded in a cedar chest. Today, only the birth entry remains, the ink barely holding to the paper. The space where the marriage once stood is a silence in the record, as if those intervening years had been erased. Whether that silence was meant to protect the living or conceal the dead is something no ledger can tell. It was recorded as an agricultural mishap, the sort that could befall any man in the last light of an October day. The beam had fallen from the loft without warning, striking the man across the chest before he could turn. Those who reached him said the sound it made was unlike the break of wood or bone alone, something heavier, final. By the time they carried him from the barn, his breath had already gone. The burial was arranged before nightfall in the cold earth of the family plot behind the house. There were no hymns, no formal procession. Only 3 men remained long enough to lower the coffin, and none stayed to speak with the widow. She stood a distance away, hands folded under the weight of her swelling belly, her face still as if the event had not yet reached her. Later, it was noted that she did not approach the grave once the others had left, but instead turned back to the house without looking behind. Through that winter, the homestead remained shuttered. The smoke from the chimney was steady but thin, as though the fire within was kept small. Neighbors passing on the road remarked that she rarely stepped outside, tending to the animals in the dim hours before dawn or after dusk. She declined offers of help in a tone neither grateful nor cold, simply insisting she had no need. The field where the accident had taken place was left untouched. The hay bales lay sodden under frost, the collapsed beam still where it had fallen. By early spring, the wood had taken on a strange discoloration. A local boy sent to fetch a tool from the barn returned pale, claiming the air inside smelled of rust and wet earth, though no metal had been left to corrode. Others avoided the place altogether. When the county man came to collect tax records, he found her alone in the front room. She spoke clearly, answering each question without pause, yet he left with the impression that she had been rehearsing her responses. On his way out, he noticed a hammer and nails on the kitchen table, the kind used for coffin work, though no repairs were visible in the house. By midsummer, the field grass had grown waist-high around the barn, and the beam still lay in its place. A visitor from the next county, who had known the husband in his youth, later said the scene was unsettling, not for its neglect, but for its exact preservation. Nothing had been moved, not even the smaller splinters, as if the ground had been left to hold the memory undisturbed. She did not speak of the accident in the months that followed. When it was mentioned by others, she would acknowledge the words, but offer nothing in return. Her days settled into a rhythm of tending the garden, feeding the animals, and repairing clothing, the sounds of her work carrying faintly through open windows. Yet at night, the house was dark, well before the hour when most would light their lamps, as though she preferred the rooms unlit. In the years after, the barn was dismantled, its boards reused in outbuildings farther from the main house. The field was planted again, but no plough ever crossed the exact spot where the beam had fallen. Even in later seasons, the grass there grew differently, thinner, paler, and touched by frost long before the rest. It is still marked on some maps as the Hollow Field, though no official record explains why. The track to the homestead began where the county road thinned to dirt, then narrowed further until wagon wheels left deep, uneven ruts. In wet weather, they filled with black water that never seemed to dry. Travelers said the turnoff was easy to miss, as if the trees leaned inward to obscure it. Past the last ploughed field, the land dipped, and the light shifted in a way difficult to describe, muted, even on clear days. The house itself stood with its back to a low rise, its roofline just visible from the approach. The windows faced away from the track, offering no welcome to those who might pass. Few did. Neighbors lived miles apart, and those in the nearest cluster had no business in that direction. It was a place reached only with intent, and in most cases, that intent was discouraged before the journey began. When county assessors last visited, they noted the unusual stillness around the property, no chickens in the yard, no laundry on the line. Yet the vegetable garden was orderly, the fences intact. It gave the impression of a place maintained for its own sake, not for the view of others. The assessor remarked privately that even the sounds of the surrounding woods seemed to halt at the edge of the yard. The widow, still carrying the child she would bear alone, had withdrawn entirely by the second winter. A single set of footprints would be found in the snow, leading from the door to the shed and back again. Any delivery left at the gate was collected without a word, sometimes hours later, as if she had been watching from inside. The gate itself bore a heavy lattice, more suited to keeping something in than keeping others out. There were whispers in the town that the house was not built for its present occupants. The original owners had left without selling, abandoning furniture and tools, taking only clothing and personal papers. A letter found years later in a courthouse drawer hinted at unsettling occurrences, but offered no specifics. The few repairs made to the structure since then were functional rather than decorative: storm shutters with new hinges, an added lock to the cellar door. By spring, the ruts in the road had deepened so much that wagons risked losing a wheel. This was said to be intentional, the work of someone quietly discouraging travel. On more than one occasion, a rider passing through claimed to see a figure at the upstairs window, unmoving, watching. None could say for certain if it was the widow or the boy, though those who saw it insisted it stood too still to be either at ease. A travelling peddler, unaware of the house's reputation, stopped once to offer wares. He left with the uneasy impression that the door had been opened before he could knock, and that the person inside had been waiting. When asked later if he had seen the boy, he could not be sure, only that there had been a second presence behind the widow, shadowed and silent. In the years that followed, the road grew nearly impassable. Grass and saplings took hold between the ruts, and the only sign of life at the homestead was the faint line of smoke in the cold months. From the town, it was easy to believe the place had emptied altogether. Yet those who strayed close enough claimed that certain nights carried the sound of boards shifting under weight, slow and deliberate, as if someone inside was moving from room to room long after the lamps should have been extinguished. The first months after her husband's death brought no change to the routines at the house. The widow tended the animals, split kindling, and moved between the rooms with the same measured pace. Her condition became apparent only as the winter settled in, the heavy folds of her coat no longer disguising the shape beneath. Those who passed along the road might have expected her to seek help from the relatives in the next county, but she did not. The letters sent to her went unanswered. 2 midwives, acting on the insistence of a church elder, rode out on separate occasions. Both returned within minutes of arriving, saying only that the woman had met them at the threshold and assured them she had everything she needed. One of them noted the door was already unlatched, as if the widow had been waiting for her arrival, though no prior notice had been given. By the second trimester, the house had grown quieter still. Deliveries left at the gate remained untouched for hours, sometimes until after dark. A boy sent with a parcel claimed he heard the faint sound of humming from an upstairs room, steady and low, as though meant to soothe someone unseen. He swore the sound stopped the moment his boots crunched on the gravel. The garden lay dormant under frost, but the paths between the beds were kept clear. It was as if she moved through them daily, retracing steps out of habit or discipline. A neighbor who ventured close enough to call from the fence reported that her voice, when it answered, seemed to come from a distance, not muffled, but detached, speaking across a space larger than the small rooms could allow. Inside, the layout of the house was altered. A visiting tax collector in early spring found that the front parlor had been stripped of furniture, its windows boarded from the inside. When asked about it, she replied only that she preferred to keep one room quiet. He left before completing his notes, unsettled by the smell in the hallway, clean but sterile, the air heavy with a faint metallic trace. Her preparations for the birth were deliberate but invisible. Lee to the outside world. No blankets or swaddling cloths were seen drying on the line, no cradle brought in from storage. The absence of these things went largely unremarked, except by one of the midwives, who later confided that such omissions were either an oversight or a sign the mother intended to manage in a way not meant to be observed. As the days lengthened, she was seen less often at all. It was said she stayed in an upstairs room for entire afternoons, coming down only when the light began to fade. Those rare glimpses from the road showed her standing at a window, her hand resting motionless on the sill, her gaze fixed not on the view, but on the reflection in the glass. By the final month, she no longer acknowledged those who passed. The gate remained closed, its latch fixed with a length of cloth tied in a precise knot, easy to untie but never found undone. The last account before the birth came from a man delivering firewood. He insisted that he heard movement on the second floor, slow, deliberate pacing, but when she appeared at the door, she claimed she had been sitting still for hours. He left the wood stacked by the gate and did not return. When the child came, there was no record of assistance, no witness but the mother herself. What occurred in those hours remains known only to her and perhaps to the child who would later grow into the space the father had left. But even then, in the first quiet moments of life, it was said the house felt no fuller than it had before. In the earliest weeks, she was never seen without him. Whether in the garden with soil under her nails or carrying pails from the barn, the child was fixed to her hip or wrapped close in a length of worn cloth. Neighbors remarked that even while mending clothes at the kitchen table, She would keep one hand near him as though fearing he might vanish the moment she looked away. As the Aeson's turned, his presence at her side became a fixture. He learned the rhythm of her movements, how to match her stride along the garden paths, how to pause when she paused. He was never left in a cradle, nor encouraged to wander. A visitor once claimed to have seen him tracing his fingers along the exact route she walked in the yard, as if memorizing a map no one else could read. When the age came for other children to begin lessons, his name did not appear on the school roster. The teacher, curious, made the journey once to the homestead. She later told of the boy watching her from the window with an expression unreadable for his years, and of the mother stepping into view only to close the curtains without a word. After that, the teacher did not return, and his absence from the register was marked without inquiry. He was absent too from Sunday gatherings. In a place where attendance was nearly universal, this was noticed. The minister spoke of his concern to the clerk, saying that isolation could breed a strange quiet in a child. But others reminded him that the widow had always kept her own counsel, and no one pressed further. Accounts from the few who saw the boy up close agree on his stillness. He did not fidget or look away, even when spoken to. One man described it as the kind of composure found in someone much older, or someone who had learned that movement drew unwanted attention. Another observed that the boy's gaze often rested not on a person's face, but slightly past it, as if watching something behind them. By his 4th year, he was accompanying her into the barn, the shed, and the farthest corner of the property where the road curved out of sight. She began to assign him small tasks, fetching a spool of thread, carrying a folded cloth, but always within arm's reach. The sound of his footsteps was so closely matched to hers that visitors sometimes thought she moved alone until they noticed him there, half hidden by her frame. The garden paths remained narrow, worn by the same 2 sets of feet. No new tracks led away from he yard. It was as though the boy had been taught the boundaries before he could test them. One farmhand delivering seed claimed he saw the child step toward the gate, only to stop abruptly, his eyes fixed on the latch as though weighing something he had been told not to touch. The mother's voice called from inside, and without hesitation, he turned back. Years later, when the boy was taller and the pair more rarely seen, a man walking the road at dusk glanced toward the house. He swore he saw them both at the upstairs window, their faces in the same light, their expressions identical in the half-shadow. What unsettled him most was not that they were standing together, but that in the dimming light he could not tell which one was watching him and which one was watching the other. By the time the boy reached his 13th year, a subtle but undeniable change had taken place in the house. Visitors, few as they were, noticed that the way she spoke to him had softened, but not in the manner of a mother toward her child. The names she used, overheard in passing, were those once reserved for her late husband. They slipped into conversation without pause, as though they had never belonged to another. Her attention to his clothing grew meticulous. The boy was dressed in jackets and shirts drawn from a trunk in the attic, garments that had belonged to the dead man. She altered them carefully, narrowing shoulders, shortening sleeves, reshaping the fit with quiet skill. The fabric bore the faint scent of camphor from years of storage, a scent that clung to the boy as though he carried the attic's air with him. Those who glimpsed him in town, on the rare occasions he was permitted there, spoke of a resemblance that had deepened almost unnervingly. It was not simply in the line of his jaw or the arch of his brow, but in his posture, in the measured way he turned his head before answered, wearing. One man said it was as if the boy had studied the dead husband's photograph until the expression had imprinted itself. Inside the house, rooms shifted in purpose. The small bedroom once used by the boy fell silent, its bed stripped, curtains drawn. At night, a single light could be seen in the larger bedroom, long after the rest of the house had gone dark. A visitor who brought a parcel of winter cloth claimed the boy answered the door wearing a vest far too formal for the errand, and that his hair had been combed with the precision of a man receiving guests. In the colder months, they were seen walking together in the garden, their strides matched in length and rhythm. The mother's hand sometimes rested lightly on his forearm, a gesture more suited to a pair of equals than to a parent guiding a child. The boy, for his part, seemed not only to accept this, but to mirror it, offering his arm as if the exchange had been rehearsed. The change in address extended beyond pet names. Letters that arrived from her family in the next county were addressed not to her alone, but to both of them, their names written together in the same line. No one knew if she had instructed her relatives to do this, or if the boy himself had begun to be presented as something other than a son. Some years later, a man repairing the fence along the edge of the property looked up toward the house and saw them standing in the upstairs window. They were positioned so closely together that their shoulders touched, their profiles nearly identical against the pale curtain. The man swore they did not move for the full minute he observed them, and that their gaze seemed fixed on some point beyond him, deep in the tree line. The clothing, the posture, the mirrored expressions, these became the subject of quiet conversation among those who still remembered the husband. The resemblance was too exact, the transformation too deliberate, to be the result of chance alone. And yet, when asked directly, the few who had seen it most clearly would only say that the boy was growing into his place, though none could define precisely what that place was meant to be. In later years, a photograph surfaced, tarnished, the edges curling with age. It showed the pair seated side by side, dressed in fine black cloth, their faces bearing the same stillness. No inscription marked the back, but those who studied it for long claimed they could not tell, in the dim grain of the image, which figure was meant to be the guardian and which was meant to be the ward. It was late summer when the photographer came through, his cart drawn by a single mule, the black cloth and brass fittings of his camera glinting in the heat. He was known to make his way along back roads, offering portraits for a small sum, leaving behind images that often outlived the subjects themselves. His arrival at the house was unannounced, yet the woman stepped out as if expecting him, the boy just behind her, matching her stride. Those who later saw the plate would remark on the uncanny precision of the pose. She sat upright in a wooden chair, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. He stood behind her, eyes fixed on the lens, his hair smoothed and parted, the jacket on his frame tailored to fit but unmistakably cut from an older man's garment. The light caught their faces in the same plane, flattening the years between them. The photographer, when pressed later, admitted he had felt an unusual stillness during the exposure. Most sitters shifted slightly, even held their breath awkwardly, but these two remained fixed, as though already accustomed to the discipline of staying in place for long intervals. He recalled thinking they were not looking at the lens, but at something behind him, though the wall was bare. The photograph was developed in the shed he carried for such work. As the image took form on the plate, the details emerged, with unnerving clarity. The delicate folds of her dress, the faint seam in his jacket sleeve where fabric had been altered, the near-perfect symmetry and the angle of their jaws. On the table beside them in the image sat a small framed photograph, blurred by depth, but discernible enough to be recognized later as a likeness of the woman with her late husband in precisely the same arrangement. When he returned to the yard to deliver the finished portrait, the boy was gone. The woman accepted the plate without examining it, sliding it into a cloth sleeve before placing it in a trunk that stood open just inside the door. Those who glimpsed inside claimed it contained other portraits, all carefully wrapped, the edges of some tarnished with age. Each appeared to feature the same woman, her companion changing only in subtle increments, always a man or boy of similar build and posture. In the years following, the plate surfaced briefly in a nearby town, propped in the window of a small mercantile after the photographer sold it along with others. Customers remarked on it enough that the shopkeeper removed it, citing discomfort among those who lingered to stare. One man swore the longer he looked, the less certain he was which of the two was meant to be the elder and which the younger. The original plate's whereabouts are now unknown. A copy exists in a private collection, its image slightly degraded, but still sharp enough to show the mirrored stillness in their eyes. The background is blank, the chair simple, yet viewers often report a sense of compression in the space between them, as if they are leaning closer together than the furniture should allow. Those who study such things have noted the photographic echo between the widow's earlier portrait with her husband and the one taken that day. It is more than mere composition. It is the deliberate recreation of an earlier moment, down to the placement of her hand and the set of her mouth. Whether it was the photographer's suggestion or her own intention remains undocumented. But in the absence of a record, the resemblance stands in place of explanation, as though the camera had caught a pattern repeating itself, one frame replacing another, without the years between ever having passed. By the boy's 17th year, their appearances in town had taken on the rhythm of an unwelcome ritual. They would arrive without announcement, the cart stopping just outside the general store, the horse standing still as if trained to wait without tether. The woman would enter first, her posture rigid, the boy following close enough that her skirts nearly brushed his boots. Inside, they moved as one. She would take each item from the shelf without hesitation, weighing nothing in her hands, rarely pausing to compare. He would carry the parcels, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. The storekeeper, who had served the family for years, noted that the purchases suited only her tastes: dark, heavy fabrics, tins of tea she alone was known to drink, and cuts of cloth meant for women's dresses. Bread, meat, and other staples were chosen in small amounts, as though feeding one person. It was remarked more than once that the boy never spoke during these visits. When addressed, he would look briefly toward her before answering, his reply no louder than necessary to be heard. Even then, the tone matched hers exactly, as if rehearsed. A man who happened to be inside one autumn afternoon said it gave the impression of one person speaking through two mouths. The visits were efficient, but without hurry. She inspected the goods with a level of attention that suggested she was more concerned with their condition than their cost. Payment was always exact. Laid out in coins, she counted twice before handing them over. The boy's hands, though capable of carrying heavy sacks, were rarely used for transactions. She retained control of the exchange, even for the smallest purchase. Over time, the storekeeper began to notice something more subtle. On certain trips, when the light through the front windows was clear enough, the boy appeared dressed in garments altered from men's suits, the seams slightly strained where the original size had been reduced. Once, under the layered fabric, the faint outline of a waistcoat was visible, a style that had not been in fashion since the death of her husband. Other customers, when the pair was gone, would speculate in lowered voices. Some thought the boy's quiet was a sign of strict upbringing. Others believed the opposite, that it was he who dictated the silence, and she who moved within its bounds. A seamstress recalled seeing the boy lift a bolt of fabric for her inspection, his hand resting on it in the same way his mother's hand once rested on his father's arm. The gesture had been so brief, she nearly doubted she had seen it. Their final visit to the store, according to the ledger, was in the spring of his 18th year. They purchased nothing unusual, just flour, lamp oil, and thread. But the storekeeper remembered the atmosphere as strained. The boy's gaze, usually downcast, was fixed instead on a shelf near the door, his jaw set as though resisting some unseen pull. She spoke to him once, sharply enough for the tone to cut the air, and his attention returned immediately to her. The following month, the storekeeper was told they would no longer be coming to town, that deliveries would be left at the edge of the property. No reason was given, but the change was accepted without question. Yet in later years, those who remembered their visits would sometimes pause when handling dark fabric or counting coins, unsettled by the sense that they had not been observing two customers at all, but a single arrangement, one mind divided between two bodies, both moving in practiced unison toward an end no one outside the house could name. On the morning of his 21st birthday, the boy moved through the yard with a bearing that caused those who saw him to pause mid-step. The resemblance to his father, dead before his birth, was exact. It was in the slope of his shoulders, the measured length of his stride, even the way he glanced toward the horizon before changing direction. Those who had known the man in life spoke of it afterward as though the years between had collapsed entirely. By then, he no longer used the small room at the back of the house. His presence in the larger bedroom was unremarked upon by anyone within the home, though it was quietly understood among those outside. A seamstress who delivered cloth for the woman's winter dress claimed she heard low voices upstairs before the door opened, the words too faint to make out, but one of them in a register so similar to the dead husband's that she froze. The transformation had not been sudden. Over the past 2 years, his clothing had shifted from loose, practical garments to tailored coats and pressed collars. Many were cut down from the old wardrobe stored in the attic, altered with an attention to detail that erased any trace of their previous owner, except for the unmistakable fit. When he walked beside her in town, their pace matched exactly, his arm bent at the same angle the husband's had been in the single surviving photograph. Those who had avoided speaking of the family began to murmur again. A mill worker, passing their cart on the road, later said he mistook the young man for the long-dead husband, not for a moment, but for the entire stretch of their meeting. It was only after the cart passed and the sound of the horse's hooves faded that the difference in years came to him, like waking from a dream. That same autumn, the woman made a visit to an old neighbor who had not seen her in years. She arrived unaccompanied, her voice steady, her expression faintly lit with something the neighbor could not place. She said simply, "I am no longer alone," in a tone that left no question in her mind as to whom she referred. Within weeks, their outings became less frequent. When they did appear together, there was an unbroken quality to their gaze, as though whatever passed between them required no words. On one such trip to the general store, the boy was seen standing a half-step behind her, his hands clasped in the same way the husband's had been during his final years. The storekeeper described feeling, for the first time, as though the air around them carried the weight of a memory not his own. The few photographs of the young man taken around this time are rare and poorly preserved, yet in each, the likeness to his father is so complete that without the dates, one could mistake them for the same man. His eyes, when studied, reveal no clear expression, only a fixed, measured stillness, as if they were looking beyond the moment captured. It is said that in the winter following his birthday, the upstairs curtains remained drawn for weeks at a time. The chimney smoke was regular, but no one could recall seeing him outdoors. When he emerged again in the spring, the resemblance was deeper still, though no one could explain how this was possible. In later years, when asked to describe the young man at 21, those who had known him would hesitate, searching for a distinction that never came. Many abandoned the attempt entirely, settling instead on the same quiet refrain. It was as though the dead had stepped back into the world, wearing the same face and with the same place beside her left waiting all along. It was recorded in the county ledger with the same precision given to any lawful union, yet those present understood there was nothing ordinary in what they had witnessed. The wedding took place in the clerk's office on a day without wind, the air heavy as though the weather itself had paused. Two distant relatives stood as witnesses, summoned not out of affection but obligation, their faces pale in the washed light from the high windows. She arrived in a silk gown preserved for more than 2 decades, the same she had worn at her first wedding. The fabric had dulled, but the stitching was intact, the seams carefully maintained, as though it had been waiting for this day. Its faint scent of cedar was matched by something colder beneath, the dry, clean odor of garments long sealed away from air and touch. The boy wore a dark suit, fitted closely, the cut unmistakably drawn from the style of the dead husband's wardrobe. The clerk's desk was bare, save for the register and an inkstand. As they took their places before it, the room felt smaller than its dimensions, the walls pressing in as if to contain them. Those who signed the certificate later said the act felt like writing their names into something already fixed, as though the event had been entered in the record before it took place. The exchange itself was quiet, the words spoken in low tones, each syllable deliberate. She stood without a tremor, her hand resting on his arm in a manner both formal and intimate. He did not look at her or at the witnesses, but at the ledger, his gaze steady on the open page, as if studying a map. When the clerk signaled for their signatures, her hand moved first, the ink settling dark and sure against the paper. His followed with the same steadiness, the letters precise enough to appear copied. No rings were exchanged. Instead, she drew from her sleeve a narrow band of gold, worn but polished, and slid it onto her own finger. It was the same ring she had worn since the death of her first husband, never removed, now reasserted, as if it had simply changed its place in the record. The witnesses later reported an odd detail. At the moment the entries were commuters. Pleated, a faint sound came from the hallway outside, something like the settling of floorboards under weight. Yet no one was seen to pass, and the door remained closed. The noise lingered for a breath longer than natural, as if whoever had made it stood just beyond view, listening. The formality concluded without celebration. The relatives left first, their footsteps quick on the steps outside. The clerk gathered the papers into the drawer, pausing briefly before closing it, as though reluctant to hide them from sight. She and the young man walked out together into the still air, their pace matched, their shadows crossing the threshold at precisely the same instant. In the weeks that followed, the ceremony was spoken of rarely, and only in private. Those who had seen the pair together before remarked that the change afterward was subtle but absolute, the way they carried themselves as if the space between them had been permanently narrowed. The gown disappeared once more into the cedar chest, its presence in the ceremony leaving no trace but in memory and record. Years later, when the marriage entry vanished from the ledger, torn away with a cut so clean it could have been made by a blade. There was no dispute over what had been removed. Yet without the page, the event could no longer be proven. The witnesses, when asked, gave only the same brief reply. They had stood in the room, they had signed their names, and they had seen two figures bound together not by time, but by something older, harder to name, and impossible to unwrite. In the years that followed the quiet ceremony, the house at the end of the track seemed poised for the sound of a child. Neighbors expected to see new garments on the line, to hear the wail of an infant carry over the fence. None came. Seasons turned, and each spring brought the same small hope among those who watched from a distance, only for it to dissolve by autumn. There were whispers of births, never announced, never marked in the county ledger, spoken of only by those who claimed to have seen a midwife arrive in the night and leave before dawn. No cradle was spotted by a window, no christening held. The few who dared mention it aloud spoke of infants too much alike to survive, of small bodies that seemed unfinished, as though the blood that made them could only circle back on itself. The midwives did not keep written accounts, but one, years later, admitted to remembering the stillness in the house on such nights. She said the rooms were kept unnaturally warm, the shutters nailed tight. The air was heavy with the scent of boiled linens, though the bedding upstairs showed no sign of rest. She recalled being guided to a back room where a single lamp burned low, its light turned toward the wall. Whatever lay in the basket there, she claimed, was wrapped too thoroughly to see, and the bundle was taken from her hands before she could speak. By the third year, the speculation deepened into something more pointed. The old talk of keeping blood pure returned, not in admiration, but in caution. It was said the line had folded in on itself so tightly that nothing healthy could come of it. The couple's isolation was now viewed not as a choice, but as a necessity born of shame. The silence from the house only seemed to confirm it. On rare occasions, the woman was seen in town alone. Her movements were efficient, her face expressionless, and her purchases smaller than before. The boy, now a man, remained unseen for long stretches, his absence noted but unremarked in public. It was as if the pair had retreated further inward, their lives measured only by the parcels brought to their gate and the smoke from their chimney. One winter, a hired hand delivering firewood reported an unusual sight. Through the frost-clouded window of the larger bedroom, he saw two chairs drawn close to the hearth. In one sat the woman, upright, her hands folded neatly. The other was occupied by a figure wrapped in blankets from head to foot, unmoving even as the flames burned low. He knocked to announce himself, but no one came to the door. By the time he looked back, the second chair was empty. The county ledger for those years holds no entries under their names beyond the initial marriage record. Whether this absence was due to omission or deliberate removal is unknown. What remains in its place are the recollections of neighbors who speak of a sense that the house was holding something it could not release, a kind of stasis, as if time within its walls had refused to move forward. Eventually the rumors hardened into a single refrain. There would be no heir. But the reason given depended on who was speaking. Some said nature had intervened, others that the pair had turned away from the attempt. And there were a few who claimed the truth was simpler and darker, that the house had already been filled and emptied more than once, and that what left it on those nights was never meant to be spoken of again. The absence was discovered during a routine inspection of the county ledger, though the discovery itself was anything but routine. The clerk on duty had opened the register to the section marked for marriages between 1899 and 1903, only to find the sequence disrupted, an abrupt gap between one entry and the next, the binding slack where a leaf had once been. The cut was too clean to be an accident. The blade that removed it had pressed hard enough to shear the page evenly along the seam, yet left the rest of the book intact. No complaint was filed. The clerk made a notation in the margin about damage to record, but the language was sparse, almost indifferent. Inquiries were made to the two clerks who had served during those years, both now retired. One claimed no memory of the marriage in question. The other admitted only that there had been an unusual union recorded, but could not recall the names. The phrasing suggested unwillingness rather than forgetfulness. The missing page was not the only anomaly. Those who examined the ledger noticed faint impressions, where the ink had once lain, as if the nib had pressed hard enough to leave the ghost of the words in the paper beneath. Under angled light, Parts of the entry could still be traced: a date in winter, the familiar curve of the widow's hand in her own name, and beside it, a surname identical to hers. The groom's given name, though blurred, was short enough to match her son's. Rumors spread quickly, carried first by those who worked in the courthouse, then by the townspeople who had always spoken of the pair in lowered tones. Some insisted the removal had been done by the family themselves, others that it had been ordered quietly by a county official. In either case, the act required access, and access required familiarity. One afternoon, months after the discovery, a clerk found the missing leaf, or what was believed to be it, folded into the back of a disused property ledger. The ink had bled faintly from contact with damp, and much of the writing was obscured. Only the signatures remained distinct, hers as steady as it had been at her first marriage, his in the same measured hand he had learned copying her letters as a child. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, a scent more at home in a private chest than in county storage. The page was returned to its place without public announcement, but by then the entry's authenticity had been rendered uncertain. A justice of the peace who examined it later said the handwriting on the clerk's portion was subtly different from other entries of that year, as if someone had copied the format from memory. When asked whether this might indicate forgery, he replied only that sometimes the record serves the story and sometimes the story serves the record. By the time the ledger passed into the hands of the next clerk, the page was gone again. The second disappearance left no trace, not even the slackened binding of the first. It was as though the leaf had never been there at all. In its place was a seam of thread, too, even to have been tied twice, suggesting the book had been rebound, the absence built into its structure. To this day, the official record contains no marriage for the widow or her son. Yet those who recall the first removal say the image of that pale seam between entries has stayed with them. A hollow in the archive where two names once stood side by side. And in the way such hollows do, it has drawn more attention in absence than it ever would have in place, as though the missing page had been cut away not to erase the truth, but to make it the only thing left to see. It was first noticed when the census taker came to the ridge that spring and found the house occupied by only one. The son's name was given in neither the household list nor in the county's other rolls, no record of his residence, no proof of his departure. The clerk who compiled the census noted the omission in the margin but did not inquire further, as if the absence were already understood. Some said he had left in the night, carrying no trunk and leaving no note. Others believed he had been sent away, though no carriage was seen and no rail ticket purchased under his name. His few belongings, boots, a shaving cup, a winter coat, remained in their places, as if he had stepped out intending to return. The bed in his small upstairs room was made, the coverlet tucked with care, though a faint impression remained in the pillow, pressed into the shape of a head that had lain there long enough to cool. The widow was untroubled when questioned. She explained only that he had moved on, her tone suggesting inevitability rather than grief. Yet she made no effort to rent the room, nor did she alter it in the seasons that followed. Visitors said the air upstairs held a peculiar chill, even in August, and that the faint smell of iron clung to the floorboards despite repeated scrubbing. A school ledger from the next township contains a brief, puzzling entry under his name, marked with a date 2 months after his disappearance. The teacher wrote that he had come to her at dusk, asking for a slate and chalk, though he carried neither coin nor satchel. She claimed his hands were raw, as though from digging, and that his eyes seemed to fix on something just past her shoulder. When she turned, there was nothing there. By the following morning, he was gone, leaving only the slate, on which no words were written. A field worker from the county poorhouse later recalled seeing the widow at the edge of her property near midnight, speaking in low tones toward the orchard. Though no other figure was visible, she paused after each phrase, as if listening for a reply. The worker kept walking, unwilling to be noticed. When he passed the same spot at dawn, the ground beneath one of the trees was freshly disturbed, the earth still damp and clinging. No grave was ever recorded. If a body was buried there, it was never marked. Those who knew the family best whispered that such a thing would not have been necessary, that whatever happened in that house had not left a body to bury. By autumn, the widow's face had grown noticeably younger, the lines about her mouth softened, her posture more upright. A traveling peddler claimed to have seen her in the market, wearing a man's watch on a chain about her neck. When asked where it had come from, she replied that it was a keepsake from her late husband, though the peddler insisted he had seen the same watch on the son's wrist the year before. In the decades since, his name has surfaced only in fragments, half-legible signatures on weathered scrap, a witness line in a property dispute, the margin of a parish register where it appears and then is struck through. The absence has become a fact more solid than any proof of his existence, as if the record had folded around the void and learned to keep its shape. Those who walk past the house today claim the upper win. Dao is sometimes open, though the current occupants insist it remains latched from within. On still nights, a shadow can be seen leaning there, unmoving, the head tilted at an angle too precise to be casual, as if listening for something long since stopped. In the years after his disappearance, she moved through the house as if nothing essential had changed. Her hair, once dark and tightly bound, turned white in slow increments, the transformation so gradual that those who saw her daily could not say when it began. She kept the silk gown folded in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed, its fabric preserved as though for an occasion still to come. Each morning, she slid the wedding ring onto her finger before drawing the curtains. The home itself grew quieter with the seasons. Floorboards that once groaned with footsteps seemed to settle into stillness, though certain boards upstairs retained the faint, hollow note of a space beneath. Neighbors noticed the curtains drawn later each year, and that her trips to market grew more infrequent. When she did go, she bought only what one person might need, though she continued to take the larger sack, as if out of habit. A doctor called to the house one winter remarked in a letter that she appeared in remarkable health for her years, her pulse steady, her posture unnaturally upright. He found it curious that she slept in the smaller of the two bedrooms, leaving the master room shut tight. The air inside, he wrote, was dense and faintly sweet, as though from flowers long since dead. He noted an indentation in the bed there, recent, not historical, and did not press her about it. The postman claimed she received letters without return addresses. He said she always accepted them without expression, never opening them in his sight. On the rare occasions she discarded them, the envelopes had been emptied and folded flat, stored in a neat stack inside a locked desk. One spring, when the wind lifted a sheet from her line, a hen, Abor found it caught in the hedgerow and swore the fabric smelled faintly of earth. In the 10th year of her solitude, a boy passing the orchard saw her standing beneath one of the older trees, her hands pressed against its bark. She seemed to be listening. He told his mother that the tree looked wrong, its trunk slightly warped, its shadow falling in the opposite direction from the others. The mother dismissed it, but the boy remembered it long after. She was found in her bed one March morning, her body composed and her hands folded neatly over her chest. The ring remained on her finger. There was no sign of struggle, no disturbance in the house, save for the cedar chest, which stood open for the first time in decades. The silk gown lay spread upon the floorboards, its bodice smoothed as though prepared for wear. The death register lists no cause beyond natural decline, though the attending physician noted her eyes had not fully closed. He described a faint crease in the pillow beside her, as though another head had lain there until moments before she was found. After the burial, the house passed briefly through the county's hands. The first family to view it refused to enter the master bedroom, reporting a low sound from within, not a voice, but something with the cadence of breath. The key to that room was later found in the pocket of her burial dress, though no one could say how it had returned there after the physician had secured it. Today, the property stands empty. The curtains are gone, and the windows reflect nothing but the pale sky. Yet those who pass on still evenings sometimes see a white shape near the orchard, still and upright, the glint of a ring catching the last of the light. In the present county ledger, the child's birth entry stands alone, the ink browned and faint at its edges. No marriage precedes it, no burial follows. His name rests in it. As allotted space, the mother's recorded in a careful hand, the father's line left blank. Between that sparse notation and the next entry, there is a gap in the scribe's otherwise uniform rhythm, as if the pen hesitated before continuing on to the next life in the parish. Those who studied the book in later years remarked upon the silence that followed his birth. No school attendance marked, no apprenticeship registered, no military service. He left behind neither property nor debts. And yet, scraps of accounts from the surrounding county hint that he moved among them longer than the ledger admits. A doctor in the Western District recorded treating a young man with an uncanny resemblance to a deceased local, noting the voice was of such similarity that it could deceive blood itself. The midwife who delivered him, long retired by the time of her recollections, claimed to have been called more than once to the same house in the years after. She spoke of infants who did not survive, each sharing a strange uniformity of feature that she could not name without unease. In her telling, the mother accepted each loss with a calm so complete it seemed rehearsed. The absence of a burial record raised quiet speculation. One theory held that he had left for the river towns, taking work where questions were fewer. Another placed him in the employ of a reclusive landowner, his duties confined to the night hours. There was, too, the account of a county clerk who claimed the youth had come to the courthouse seeking to alter his record, asking for the removal of his birth date. When told it could not be done, he left without another word. There are fewer official mentions after that. Only the faintest traces remain, a line in a ledger for wages paid to an unnamed hand, a witness signature on a land dispute in which he was not otherwise involved. Each time the handwriting matches, though the name written varies. One winter, an inspector from the state capital traveled through it, on unrelated business, and noted in his diary a man standing at the edge of the courthouse square, watching him with an expression entirely without blink or shift, as if memorizing the shape of my stance. Some time later, the county's baptism register records a child bearing his uncommon surname, though no parentage is listed. The minister responsible for the entry resigned within the month, giving no reason, and the family who had presented the child left the area shortly thereafter. By the turn of the century, his presence had faded into the patterns of rumor, men who claimed to have met someone who looked like him decades later in towns far removed, women who spoke of hearing a voice outside their window at night that called to them in a tone they recognized but could not place. A surveyor working the northern border of the county reported finding a single, carefully folded sheet of paper beneath a loose floorboard in a vacant homestead. On it was written the date of his birth and the words, "Still here." The ledger holds no more than the single, unremarkable birth record, but the absence of the rest feels deliberate. The page is unscarred, unaltered, and yet those who study it say they sense the ghost of erased lines, entries once there, now gone without the tearing of paper. When the book is closed, it rests flat, silent, and heavy, as if holding the weight of something not written but still remembered by the paper itself. If you want more stories like this, ones with missing names, erased lines, and truths too tangled to speak aloud, share where you are listening from in the comments. And subscribe to X Archives so the next record we uncover does not fade before it is told.